Welcome back to the Social Impact Level Up podcast. This is where we blur the lines between business, nonprofit, and impact. I'm your host, Wendie V, and I'm a social impact strategist here to help you build a successful and sustainable legacy of social change. In this week's episode, we're going to hear from a social entrepreneur who has been on a journey to change the world just like you. If you are interested in social entrepreneurship, this is the place for you. Let's jump right into this week's episode. Hey everyone, welcome back to the Social Impact Level Up podcast. This episode is a little different because the guest today it's me. It's me, Wendie V, your host. And I'm really excited to talk to you about some of the things that have just been coming up naturally through these conversations. As we proceed through season 2, we've kind of pivoted from talking in this podcast just about the solo social entrepreneur and your journey as a solo social entrepreneur into thinking about how do organizations and the people who run them, how do you make sure that they thrive and they're making the impact that they are designed to make and that they are fulfilling their purpose. And there's a lot of reasons why I wanted to bring these perspectives to the world, because I can see how in a lot of ways we focus so much on the aspect of business and transformation through clients and customers and money and transactions, and a lot less of bringing that world in with the completely and somewhat separate world of social impact and public organizations and nonprofits that serve communities by way of getting money and do actually act as a business, but are not classified as a business. And a lot of the times, these different types of organizations are really separate in our brains, or they're really separate in the way that we think about them, and they're really separate in the way that we interact with them. And a lot of, transformative processes that I've seen throughout my career have done a bridging between bringing business and nonprofit or public sector organizations together to solve complex problems. Everything from homelessness to thinking about how do you bring mental health into schools. There's a lot of different types of organizations that have come together across the globe to do transformative work, to talk about different social problems and how we tackle them, and how do we, over the course of time, make things better. And when you say solve, you don't really necessarily mean completely turn off a faucet necessarily. But sometimes it's really simply trickling versus flowing, right? Or even thinking about how do we begin to repair versus to continue to damage. And a lot of the times, these organizations coming together as partners, they might come together in synergy over a project or a program, but sometimes it's not lasting or it's not really even coming out to fruition with the change that people want to see. And it's really bringing all of this together to maximize what are we doing on the business side, what are we doing on this public side or the nonprofit side, and how can we make the biggest impact as not only organizations, but as people, as individual transformation agents. Whether we work in the organization or we lead an organization or we're on a board of an organization, whatever our role is in transformation, that we're able to get to the outcomes that we want. And now, of course, some of these perspectives are a little different from what you might hear in a traditional business podcast. But of course, this podcast and this YouTube channel are listed in the business category. But that's because I want people to understand that there are other types of organizations that are not solely focused on profit, that are doing amazing work, and they need to get heard. And you need to know about them. And I need to tell you about them if you're going to know about them. So that is really what this podcast is doing at this point. And I think that over the course of the last 20-ish interviews that we've released over the second season of the podcast, we're thinking about how do we transform business and how do we transform organizations and how do we transform people and communities and how do we transform ourselves, right? Us, the people who are doing the work. And all of this to say, I think that the word that we haven't said enough or we haven't talked about enough is sustainability. And you'll hear it in a few episodes coming up. You'll hear it kind of sprinkled throughout season 2. But sustainability is something that I think is really important because I've spent years in the federal government working with organizations focused on how do you sustain multi-million dollar programs and initiatives that have been put into the world because of funding, but really the work is necessary, right? The work is needed. People are benefiting from that. So how do you make sure that these opportunities don't go away when funding goes away? And it's a question that I started thinking about early on when I was focusing on this business and how to start this business. What exactly do I want to create as transformation? And one of the things that I want people to better understand is sustainability. And to think about it not necessarily as something that the UN is telling us to do related to, the transformation of the Millennial Development Goals, but really thinking about sustainability as something that we are focused on as people because we know that transformation is going to take a long time. And if we want something to really transform and really change, it has to inherently be sustainable. And sustainability starts with strong organizations and strong people within communities, people who, are allowed to and have the tools and mechanisms to thrive. And sustainable change starts with us moving an idea into action and then eventually moving that action into consistent, inspired action, measuring our outcomes, making changes, and continuing to level up. Now, when I thought about how do I bring this concept of sustainability into the world, one of the things I wanted to do was to help people understand all the different facets of sustainability. And not only different facets, but the fact that there are so many different people who are working in sustainable ways, but yet we may not know about what they're doing, and we may not be necessarily learning from what it is that they're doing, or even learning from the iterations of what they're doing. We just simply don't have the information to share. There's just not a lot of really good mechanisms in the social impact space to share lessons learned. And we have to go to the same resources over and over again to tell us how to do this work. And sustainability is something that, as I've realized over the course of time, it's not a destination that you just sort of arrive and you're like, ha, my program is sustainable. My efforts are sustained. Legacy, woohoo. That is sort of not at all how it happens. So when you're thinking about sustainability, I challenge you to think about all these different dimensions that we're going to talk about today. Because in this episode, we're focusing on my multidimensional sustainability model that I developed. I'll tell you the story of how that came about. And also thinking through, well, how have the different people that we've interviewed in this season actually shown us and demonstrated these really amazing sustainability techniques that we can all learn from. And I think that in the course of the conversation, sometimes we just kind of flow. And I'm sure if you listened to this podcast before, you know that there's kind of just a flowing conversation amongst people. So we don't always stop to process, but this episode is all about processing, taking some of the things that we talked about in the episodes, some of the people's points and perspectives and stories that were shared, and breaking them down in terms of this multidimensional sustainability model that I mentioned. And the reason why I think this is an important pause to take in between all the other episodes that are going to come out for the rest of this season is because there are things that we'll continue to talk about that as a listener or as a viewer, I want you to take notice of, and I want you to apply it to your organization or to exactly what you are doing. And it doesn't have to apply in the same way that my story resonates or someone else's story might resonate with you. But I want you to think about how exactly can you learn from what you're gleaning out of what we're talking about? And then thinking about with your organization, what changes could you make to make your work more sustainable or to challenge your partners to really focus on sustainability? Or if you're not making an impact that you want to make, to figure out how you could make an impact in a sustainable fashion. And of course, we're not talking about just eco-friendly, thinking about the strategies that are just, green strategies. When we're talking about sustainability, what you're going to see in this model is that we're really talking about the way the work is shaped and how you do it and why that matters to making sure that we are going to create lasting change. And those words all, can seem like very fluffy words in the impact space because you hear people all the time say, I make an impact, I'm making lasting change, this is sustainable. There's all these different ways that we can think about these concepts. So, what I want to present to you is something really tangible that you can use to help level up your organization. And as you do that, I would love for you to further explore the other dimensions that are maybe not as comfortable for you because you're just not there yet or you're not ready to tackle those. And that's absolutely okay. So let's dive right in. We're going to pop into thinking about how we as people, as organizations, can apply this multidimensional sustainability model in our lives and also how this can really help us reach our goals and our outcomes for the work that we want to do in the impact driven space. So, the first thing we have to realize in this model is that this didn't just come out of thin air, right? Wendy didn't just come to a whiteboard one day and start writing words down like she normally does. The reason why this model even exists is because early on in my business, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, some colleagues that I have there, had moved a program and were interested in my perspectives on how this program could be sustained and what could be done around it. So I presented them with this model. Now, of course, that aside, sort of went away, didn't end up going anywhere, but except to just give people some information, which is great. And then I went through this model and I realized that this is so much more helpful to other funders and other organizations. So I've continued to provide technical assistance and training around this model for other people. But where it comes from is from years of looking at and dissecting and working through the challenges of individual organizations who were doing impact driven work, whether they're school districts, nonprofits, thinking about community based organizations in other countries, all these different lessons that I've learned throughout the course of my life. I just put them into a bunch of bullets and started talking about them, to be honest. And lo and behold, what I found over the course of time that I've been teaching this material is that people have resonated so much with the individual facets of this multidimensional model because they realize that somewhere in their learning, in their practice, somebody wasn't telling them about this. Like somebody wasn't talking about these things and somebody wasn't breaking it down to say, here's the steps that you take in order to be successful, to sustain your work. And now that I'm kind of unleashing this knowledge in the world, people are like, oh, this is so much more tangible. Now sustainability suddenly doesn't seem like I just have to have eco-friendly strategies and meet some sort of threshold set by the UN. What it really means is how I do my work and how I create change or co-create change with the people I serve. If I want to do that over time and I want to have a legacy and I want to create lasting change, I need to invest in a lot of different types of strategies and think about when I'm making decision, how can I make the most sustainable decision? So this is what I wanted to offer to you, my podcast listeners, is to really help you think through this strategy and then apply it to your organization. Now, here we go. We're going to jump in and do some very quick processing of the podcast guests that we've had, the multidimensional sustainability framework, and how this applies to your organization all at the same time. So the first facet is communications and marketing for impact. Now, communications and marketing for impact, when I say that, what I've seen in the past is so many impact-driven organizations who they may be practicing marketing and techniques and telling people that they exist, but what they're missing is the opportunity to tell people about the true transformation that they create. And the way that they do that for the specific audiences that they need to reach matters. So if you are an organization who is making an impact, or you are a business who wants to make an impact, it's important how you do this to help your organization continue to level up. And sometimes I think that impact driven organizations are not successful in this area or limit their own success in this area because they feel like they don't know what they're doing around marketing, or they just don't know the exact steps to take that are going to help. So instead of really doing something with a shoestring budget, what happens is either nothing gets done or the investment is made in something that's really not going to bring the value that they're looking for. So, what I can say is for organizations who are directly doing impact based work, who are on the ground, who are grassroots, the transformation that you create is what matters to other people. You need to find ways to connect with folks on a values level to bring them in to support your organization and your vision. And as you do that, the growth will come from finding the aligned people who are going to connect with your organization's work and your vision. Now, of course, all of that to say, I'm sure you're already trying this, but some of it really does take some marketing techniques that we see a lot in the business world. Now, on the business side, what we see sometimes is impact driven businesses don't talk about their impact or don't talk about how they're working with their nonprofit partners because they're simply doing it out of the goodness of their heart. And as much as we love that, and I love that for you if this is you, but I also think that you're missing an opportunity to really help people choose to invest in your business and the way that you do business versus your competitors because of the values that they align with in your organization and the work that you're doing. So, whether you're a nonprofit or whether you're a social business, thinking about how you can use your marketing to demonstrate your impact, to bring in more interest for your organization, this is a core part of sustainability. And when I saw over years and years and years of training grantees on communications, sometimes we would miss really connecting these two pieces of marketing and communications and being a sustainable organization. So I want to make sure that we give marketing and communications its due justice to say it's not everything, but it is something that we have to invest in, not only as organizations, but also as funders, to know that if we want to sustain work over time, we have to communicate about that work. Now, I'll give you an example from one of the episodes that I think is absolutely amazing. Dr. Lori Marks joined us for an episode that talked about her organization, Linking Generations. And in that episode, she did a beautiful job conveying the impact of the work that she's doing. It was absolutely magical. And it was fantastic as a host to see that this was Lori's first podcast that she'd ever been on. This is the first podcast she's ever marketed her organization on. And I was so happy for her. I was also very happy to see that she shared her podcast episode so widely in marketing channels on her organization that her podcast episode is still, to this day, even though it was earlier in the season, one of the most watched episodes this season. I love that for Lori because I think that her work is very important and things that we need to be learning from organizations like Lori's. How do you step up and do the marketing practices, even if they seem a little difficult? And if you're a solo founder, a new nonprofit founder, or someone who is working in a small nonprofit, that might mean you being on the actual podcast or in the marketing. So, of course, that can be a little uncomfortable, but this is something that we have to do to be able to sustain our work. The next point in our multidimensional sustainability model is leading with passion. Every organization, obviously, we want people who are passionate about the work working in the organization to support it, not only in leadership, but also on the day-to-day work that the organization does. So whether you're a business or a social business or a nonprofit, having passionate leaders that are both, in leadership roles and in non-leadership roles, but allowing people to really focus on the impact and the mission and to be joining in with your organization in that impact mission. So if you are a social business who has not actually said you have an impact mission, then it's difficult for your people who work for you, your employees, to buy into the impact mission that you have in your head that you have not communicated. And in the world where it's so difficult to retain employees, both in businesses and in public sector nonprofits, it's important for us to really be supporting our workers and connecting to our organization in any way that we can that's positive. So, connecting with our values, connecting with our mission, connecting with the impact that we make, internally communicating all of that to our workforce and to our leaders. This is how we begin to create this culture of change and really focusing on coming to it from a place of passion. Because unlike organizations where we solely focus on the profit mission, in a nonprofit or in a social business or in a public sector organization, we have the ability to focus on something else other than profit. We have the ability to focus on the passion, the reason why we're here to do this work. Now, if you're an aspiring leader and you're just starting to ignite your interest in this area, the one thing I can tell you as a tip is that you have to focus on finding that passion and trusting your instincts to follow it. There's a lot of conversations in season 1 about this and about how you level up to being in this space of being able to make the choices you want to make. In season 2, Rick Ornelas talks all about this and gives you key examples from his journey and how he was able to move out of a space where his talents and skills weren't necessarily being recognized and appreciated to following his passion every day. I think a lot of you have been following, if you've been following this podcast, will have heard my journey as well, moving out of spaces where I didn't feel necessarily like my personal mission and the organizational mission and the mission of our leaders were all in alignment. And a lot of the times, those organizations are the ones that struggle the most with retaining good workers. So when we're talking about sustainability and talking about leadership and passion, the reason these things are connected is because we want to maintain people within our organizations who can continue to create transformation and change. And the ways that we do that is to make sure that their passion is continually ignited. Now, the next part of the framework can get a little dicey when I talk about it sometimes, because sometimes I know that change is difficult for organizations and change is difficult for people, but I also know that conversations around money can be difficult. So I'm going to preface this one by saying that I want you to just have an open mind about the reason why we come to this work is to get to the outcomes and make impact. So if we are going to be sustainable organizations, we have to invest in things that work and divest or no longer invest in things that do not work. And I see that a lot of times organizations will continue to try to make a strategy work or will continue to try to do something that there is evidence to demonstrate it is not working. And investing and divesting, you want to do this once you have some information about how things are working. So for your impact organization, if you are focused on a product or a service or a program that is not getting you the results that you want or is not achieving outcomes, well, then why are we continuing to put our resources in that place? So we have to ask ourselves and have times of reflection and assessment to see what really matters and where are we allocating our resources. In a recent episode with David Delisle, he explains this in terms of personal finances, but I think it's the same principle that's absolutely related to our organizations as well, which is how can we focus on what brings happiness and what matters in our organizations? And it doesn't just mean happiness, like let's be happy and that's the outcome, but how can we bring peace in the organization? How can we bring peace and thriving to the people that we serve? And how can we make sure that when we're making our organizational investments, that the organizational investments are made in the right places to get the outcomes that we desire? Sustainability for social impact organizations is more than just making sure we invest in the things that are working. It's also about having the appropriate funding resources to do the work that we want to do. to do the amazing things that we do every single day as impact driven organizations. And the next part of the framework is thinking about how can you leverage coordinated and complementary funding streams to do the work that you want to do. If you are a social business, this means thinking about how can you bring in the right revenue and resources to your customers and clients to fulfill your impact mission. If you're a nonprofit or a public sector organization, this might look a little different because you have different options for the types of revenue or resources you can bring in. But at the same time, we collectively have access to resources from business and nonprofit to put towards impact mission. So the more that we can find alignment between the types of funding that are available to different organizations and bring partnerships together to do this work, then the closer we can get to really making sure that our resources are coordinated and maximized and that we're using them the best way that we can. Now, as we think about diversifying resources, the other connection I want to make for you is that social businesses provide something that's very valuable for nonprofits. And as a business, we probably don't think about it as much as we should. But giving away through our corporations and through our individuals in our corporations, these are important pieces of the pie for nonprofits because they can provide unrestricted revenue resources that nonprofits need to operate. So if you are a social business and you want to give and you don't necessarily know how, or you're not doing it on a regular basis, not only having an impact mission, but also having a vehicle to actually fulfill that impact mission by making sure that any revenue or resources that you want to share with partners regularly can be shared, and you have a system to do that. Now, if you're a nonprofit and you're thinking about, well, how can I make sure to coordinate all of my resources and make sure they're complementary to my programming so that I can sustain my work? Corporate relationships and business relationships are a place to put your energy. And sometimes there can be a barrier in communication or how you can really come together. And that's where local groups like chambers of commerce, different kinds of clubs or resources, different things operated by your county in your city, come to those organizational events so that you can really start to build bridges between the business community and those of us who are out working in nonprofits or public sector and organizations working directly with the causes that we're passionate about. Now, one other very interesting facet of this is there's always a new way to generate revenue. And if we are not on top of it all the time, we might miss something. So earlier in the season, we talked to Dorothy Odell, and Dorothy Odell told us about a way we could leverage to get revenue that we might have forgotten about. If you remember telethons from back in the day, where television hosts would come on and talk to you for hours about a very specific cause they were passionate about, there would be phone banks and people and all these calls coming in with donations. Well, Dorothy Odell has somehow figured out how to do this with live streaming. And so if you are an impact organization who is looking for new ways to engage your audiences and to make sure that your donors and people with aligned values are coming to support you, live streaming might be an interesting place for you to look. The next part of the multidimensional sustainability framework is thinking through what is your organization or your partner's long-term strategy for change, and how do you start moving towards a more sustainable place of transformation. And in order to get there, you need a strategy. You need to have a roadmap. And although strategies aren't always the most fun to connect and develop, it is something that is very meaningful for either you as an individual or for your organization to know how transformation is going to happen, to have a plan. So we talked earlier in the season to Carrie Tottingham about this, and she mentioned the exact same thing. Strategies aren't just a bunch of boxes and lists to tick and say, okay, I did this, I did this, I did this, but really thinking about how do we connect our vision and our organization and the culture and the transformation that we need to make within the organization so that we can use it as a vehicle to fuel social change. And whether that's a social business, a nonprofit, a public sector organization, it does not matter. We do all need to have some sort of long term strategy to know that what we're doing is going to make an impact and it's going to be sustainable over time. Otherwise, going back to the investment divestment conversation, if it doesn't make change, why are we doing it? Does it really matter? So, thinking about how can you within your organization really focus on having a long-term change strategy, even if it's not on paper, that's something that's been communicated to people so that they know that they're part of something bigger and part of that change, so that people are able to really buy into what exactly it is that you're doing as an organization. Now, speaking of partnerships, the next facet is partnerships and capacity building. Now, the reason this is important in the social impact space for sustainability is because it's often very isolating to work as a social entrepreneur. We've heard this throughout the episodes that people have talked about multiple times, feeling like they were the only one working in this space, or they were the group that had to lead because no one else was there leading in this space. And sometimes as leaders in social impact organizations, we'll find that we're, out in front of something, but we might feel a little bit like we're by ourselves. So what building partnerships and building capacity does is to help you not only not carry that torch by yourself, but also have others to pass the torch on to when it's time for you to naturally move on to something else. Now, of course, recognizing that not all of us are going to be in any particular seat forever. So, having some sort of ability to pass the work on that you're doing to others that will carry it forward and continue to do it in a proper fashion, that is something that is definitely sustainable. And as I mentioned in one of the upcoming episodes, one of the pieces of advice that stuck with me through my entire career was something that someone told me the first time I moved to Africa when I lived in Uganda in a village. They said, as someone who's doing this impact work, as someone who's doing international aid work, your job is to work yourself out of a job, because there will naturally be capacity in the communities that you serve, in the populations that you serve, to do exactly what it is that you do. Now, they may not have had the opportunities that you have had. They may not have the education and training that you have. But if you could build the capacity, then you will not only not be necessary, you not being necessary is a good thing. So, this is what I mean when I say partnership and capacity building. It's more than just gather a group of people and have a meeting every month. It's about figuring out how we can solve problems and then pass on the solutions to the people who should naturally be enacting them, to the organizations and groups who are now in place to take on and carry the work that might not have existed before. So there's a lot of pieces of this that are really, really important about how businesses and nonprofits can come together to really make sure that the right partners are at the table and that we're building the right capacity to really solve problems and create change. One example of this from a past episode, Kat Lecoq, who is one of my coaches that I absolutely love working with, she does a brilliant job explaining how she builds bridges between what they call in the UK corporates or corporations and impact organizations to make sure that there are ways for people who are doing the work to directly get information, feedback, resources, and connect with corporations. And this is something that she explains in a way that's so beautiful because it's very clear that this is not traditionally done, but in a way that she's able to do it with the organization she's been part of, there will be a legacy of changing both types of organization, both the business and for the people that the nonprofit or the impact organization serves. So there's a lot of ways that we can leverage partners, new ways to break the traditions that we've had in the past, but make sure that we're not only sharing monetary resources, but that we're sharing human resources as well, human capital. The next part of the framework is thinking about shared risk and protective factors. Now, shared risk and protective factors, as I mentioned before, my work with the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the shared risk and protective factors pieces of my model come from work from CDC, or the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in the United States. And in this model, what they teach us is that there are common risk factors in a lot of communities and for a lot of people's lives that can lead to a lot of negative outcomes later in life. Now, similarly, there are things that can help us or protect us from those negative outcomes, maybe mitigate some of the risk that we've actually had in our lives. And in order to do that, in order to really work with this model, you need to think about how can you mitigate risk factors and how can you increase protective factors. So when I added the sustainability model, the reason why was because what I want people to start doing with their impact work is to focus on root causes and really what helps people be resilient and what helps people thrive. How do we create thriving communities and a thriving globe even? How do we make sure that the natural resilience that exists continues, but also that we're building and supporting people through their journey? And a lot of the clients I work with, a lot of the people that are in my life, they focus on supporting either communities of color in the United States or folks who have experienced some sort of marginalization throughout their lives and experienced inequities. And a lot of the times, what I talk to my clients about is our job as social entrepreneurs is to start closing those gaps to fill them with the resources that we have the ability to bring. So our natural talents, our natural opportunities, our abilities to get grants, our abilities to find coordinated funding, our ability to bring in donations, our job is to help fill these gaps, help fill the inequities that we see, and help get to the root causes to really, really create lasting change. And now, as you can hear, the next part of the framework is inequity. How do we make sure that we're addressing all of the inequities that are traditionally existed and not creating any new ones through our programs and our services that we provide as impact organizations? If you're a business, you might think about this as more than just your DEI initiative. It's really how can we help resources flow from one group to another? How can we help groups that traditionally have not been empowered to be able to share power with folks who may not actually want to give it up? And we, as social entrepreneurs, a lot of the times we find ourselves navigating these spaces between folks who have power and have resources and folks who do not. And sometimes that can be a very difficult and challenging navigation path. Now, what I want you to focus on that is sustainable, not only for you and your organization, is the wins that you take towards closing those gaps and bridging those inequities. Those wins matter. And going back to the beginning of the conversation, those pieces are pieces that we have to have more marketing around so that we understand and other organizations understand how to do the work of dismantling the inequities that exist. Because sometimes things have perpetuated so long that we just take them for granted and think we can't change them without recognizing that a lot of these inequities are perpetuated not by choice, but by tradition. And if we change some of the systems and the ways that things work, we will begin to start dismantling these inequities that exist. Now, a great example of this is Adriana Dawson, who talks about in her episode how she used her language skills as a child to not only help people navigate systems, but also to help people who were in need around her family who didn't have access to translators or resources in their language. And it's such a beautiful story because it reminds us that bridging inequities can be something as simple as helping a child who is acting as a translator for a family, right? So there's so many ways that we can begin to do this naturally within the work that we're doing, that as social entrepreneurs, if we leave this part out, if we forget this part, it will jeopardize our sustainability. And so I want people to begin to understand that equity is not separate from or a different initiative from your impact mission. It is all one and the same, and it's all leading to the sustainability of the change that you want to make with the vision that you are passionate about. Now, I also mentioned about shared and risk and protective factors, but I forgot to talk about this story that resonated with me from this season. Anthony Obus and I had a wonderful conversation about entrepreneurship and about how it's difficult as someone of color to step out and become an entrepreneur, particularly a social entrepreneur who is more passionate about the change that they're making than they are really about the profit that's possible. And in that space of exploring options like career choices, college, all these other things that you have to navigate, if you are a first generation or someone who is the first in their family to navigate those things, it can be very challenging when you're coming from a place of not a lot of resources, maybe limited educational opportunities, maybe limited employment opportunities. And having to be resilient and having to overcome some of these obstacles, having to navigate all those paths as the first one, something that's resonated with a lot of people this season is that the reason that they come to the place of passion to do the work that they do is because they want the road for other people to be easier. They want the road that others take behind them to be more navigable, to make sure that it's actually helpful for others to learn from their journey and their mistakes and their challenges. And I think that that's something that this podcast is doing, is helping us get a glimpse into not only what are the challenges that people have faced as they do this work, but also how have they successfully navigated, got knocked down, got back up, and kept going. And that part of it has been really cool to see because sometimes, like I said before, as individual social entrepreneurs, we think that we are by ourselves in this race, but we don't recognize that there are people around us who are going through similar things that also can help us learn how to navigate the things in our lives as well. So that's been something that I think this season has been extremely powerful at sharing. It will continue to be extremely powerful at sharing through the next few episodes. We do plan to go throughout the end of this year. This is 2023. And this season will have about 40 episodes where we will talk about and continue to talk about all of these themes. Now, the one thing I don't have in the multidimensional sustainability model, but we cannot leave it out because it is absolutely essential to all of the things that we do, is recognition that our well-being as social entrepreneurs is one of the most powerful things that we have. We have the obligation to maintain our wellness in order to continue to show up and create change and transformation. And if we are ignoring our own well being, then we are actually jeopardizing our sustainability. And the reason why your well being is just as important as my well being is because we have important transformation to create. We have important change that we are guiding. And our job here, if we are following our passion, is to complete that mission. And when we are not able to, when we are not well enough to complete that mission, then we are not doing our job effectively. So it's important for us to take time away, to do some respite care, to make sure that we're replenishing ourselves, to reflect, to continue to challenge ourselves, and to make sure that we're doing the mindset work, the mental health work, the therapy, the hypnotherapy, all of the things that we need to be doing to replenish ourselves, to continue to show up and serve. This is an important facet that we've talked about pretty much in every episode this season. And I think it matters because when you hear what people talk about as their practices of how they maintain their well-being, I hope that what you take away from it is inspiration to continue to work on your own. Because each of us has our own challenges, each of us as organizations and as people have our own issues to navigate every single day. But it's important for us to navigate those ups and downs in a way that's going to allow us to, if we get knocked down, continue to come back and show up and serve. So that is today's episode. I hope that you enjoyed this talk. Again, this was a solo episode where I wanted to just really dive into some of the different facets of what we talk about on this podcast, to tie up some loose ends, to really bring in some theory and some information from not only my work and my reflections, but also just the stories that we're sharing throughout this podcast. They're so powerful, they're so meaningful, and there's so many ways that these stories can be helpful for you if you apply the lessons that you're learning. So I hope that you take away some value from this. And I'm looking forward to hearing from you and also seeing you around social media. And I hope you'll join us for another episode very soon.